Imagine walking through the jungle. The tall trees block most of the sunlight, casting long shadows on the ground below. You hear a loud crash in the underbrush, and suddenly a giant lizard with enormous teeth and claws appears before you. It lets out a deafening roar, sends you running for your life. If this sounds like an exciting scene from a Jurassic Park movie, then we've got some good news for you. Turns out dinosaurs did not make such sounds. That's right. Contrary to popular belief, they couldn't roar. Hi, and welcome to Paleo Logic. Today we'll take a look at what evidence tells us about the noises dinosaurs made, which turns out is much more interesting than you might think. First, let's talk about why dinosaurs probably didn't roar. To roar is to make a loud, breathy sound by forcing air through the larynx or voice box while the vocal cords are closed. Mammals can also make other sounds by changing how their mouth and throat work together with their larynx. Dogs, for instance, can whine, growl, and bark. And we humans can speak because of the special way our mouths and throats work with our voices. But what does any of this have to do with dinosaurs? Well, it turns out that roaring is a distinctly mammalian trait. No other animal group does it. Birds don't roar, nor do reptiles or amphibians. So if dinosaurs were more closely related to reptiles than mammals, as scientists now think, then they couldn't have roared. But if dinosaurs weren't roaring, then why do we picture them as roaring? Well, it's mostly because of movies. But there was also one famous scientist who suggested that dinosaurs likely roared. In 1915, paleontologist Sir Arthur Smith Woodward described the first complete skeleton of a saurian found in England. This dinosaur, a type of Ankylosaurus, lived during the late Jurassic period about 150 million years ago. Woodward named it Baryonyx walkeri. As he studied the fossil, Woodward noticed a hole behind the dinosaur's eye socket, just above where its nostrils would be if it had a face like a crocodile. He knew that this hole was part of the dinosaur's middle ear. And he also knew that mammals use this hole to amplify the sound they make by forcing air through their larynx. So he concluded that baryonyx and other theropods must have been able to roar. It wasn't until nearly 80 years later that we realized why our theropod friend had that extra hole in his skull. Instead of having a large opening to the outside behind their eye sockets, modern birds have a membrane covering this area. This membrane is connected to the bird's jaw muscles. When a bird opens its mouth, the membrane tightens, making sure that air flows through the bird's syrinx, its version of a larynx. This wouldn't have been useful to dinosaurs unless they also had a big opening in their skulls, which they did. In 2004, researchers used high-tech imaging to look inside a Tyrannosaurus fossil. Sure enough, they saw a large opening where the membrane would have been. In 2007, researchers took things a step further and reconstructed the head of a juvenile T-Rex. Using computer modeling, they tested how different shapes of the T-Rex's head would affect airflow. Their results supported Woodward's hypothesis that theropods could roar. So maybe we should still picture dinosaurs roaring, right? Well, unfortunately, it seems that even if dinosaurs could roar, they probably didn't. In 2019, a team of paleontologists and evolutionary biologists conducted a thorough study on the subject. They gathered data from over 250 species of living birds and grouped them into different categories based on how they produce sound. They also looked at the evolutionary history of these groups and compared their findings with anatomical evidence from extinct animals. And what they found was that the ability to make sound like a mammal evolved independently multiple times in birds. In other words, the ability to make sounds like dogs or cats didn't come from a common ancestor. Instead, it evolved separately several times throughout avian evolution. And since it evolved so many times, it's unlikely that the last common ancestor of all birds could make those sounds. And if it couldn't do that, it couldn't roar either. So why don't birds roar? Well, when researchers looked at the anatomy of birds that could make mammal-like sounds, they discovered something very interesting. Birds that could make mammal-like sounds had a bony ring around their voice box known as the cricoid cartilage. Most birds have a similar ring, but their cricoid cartilage is made of cartilage instead of bone. This ring of bone doesn't seem to help birds breathe, but it may have something to do with producing sounds. Birds with this bony ring surround their voice box with muscles that can pull it open, allowing for more air to flow through the trachea. This may allow the bird to produce louder, more complex sounds, including growling and croaking. These birds also have strong jaw muscles that can be used to modify sounds produced by the voice box. Basically, they've co-opted their existing skeletal system to make new sounds. The only problem is that birds that roar still don't sound like dinosaurs. So what did dinosaurs actually sound like? To find out, the research team turned to the fossil record. They looked at hundreds of fossils from the genus Archaeopteryx, a relative of birds that lived during the late Jurassic. Some were more bird-like than others, while others appeared more reptile-like. But no matter how bird-like or reptile-like they were, none of the Archaeopteryx had a bone ring around their voice box. It seems that this adaptation came later in avian evolution, so they probably couldn't make mammal-like sounds. However, the team found another line of evidence pointing to a particular sound. Fossils of feathered dinosaurs reveal tiny holes where feathers once attached to their skin. By looking at how these holes are shaped, scientists can tell whether the dinosaur had downy feathers like a baby bird or long pointed feathers like the tail feathers of a peacock. What they found was that feathered dinosaurs like Ankylosaurus and Microraptor had downy feathers that would have made them look like a big ball of fluff. And not only that, but these downy feathers would have also made them sound like big balls of fluff. In 2018, a team of researchers led by paleontologists conducted an experiment. They recreated the feathers of Ankylosaurus and Microraptor and placed them on a robotic model of each animal. Then they blew air through the trachea and measured the sounds produced. They found that Microraptor, which had long pointed tail feathers, made a whooshing sound similar to an eagle or hawk screeching. Meanwhile, Ankylosaurus, with its short downy feathers, made a purring sound like a big cat. So there you have it. Turns out dinosaurs probably didn't roar, but they may have sounded like big cats and birds of prey. So why don't we picture them that way then? Well, we tend to think of dinosaurs as scary monsters, which is why many artists depict them roaring. But they may not have been as scary as we think. Many dinosaurs lived alongside smaller feathered dinosaurs. And if they were roaring, it would have been hard to hide. Moreover, if the larger dinosaurs were fierce predators, it seems unlikely they would hang around with their prey. One exception is the famous feathered dinosaur Velociraptor, which is portrayed as a ferocious roarer in the Jurassic Park franchise. But according to some paleontologists, it may have been more chicken than T-Rex. In 2016, a team of researchers examined the bones of a relative of Velociraptor called Oviraptor. Like other birds, Oviraptor had feathers, and like many dinosaurs, it had a large hole behind its eye socket. But unlike other dinosaurs, its jaws were more like a turtle's, which means that it couldn't move them independently from its skull. This means that Oviraptor couldn't make mammal-like sounds, but it could have made turtle-like sounds, such as hissing, clicking, and growling. So put together with what we know about Velociraptor, we can picture it making sounds like a goose or a peacock. Now we can only imagine what the terrifying roar of a Tyrannosaurus Rex sounded like. But thanks to this research, we can at least say that it didn't sound like a lion or a tiger. In fact, now that we've debunked the myth of the roaring dinosaurs, we hope you'll consider supporting us. We depend on our viewers for funding so that we can keep making videos. It takes less than a minute and really helps us out. And remember, if you click the subscribe button, you'll get to watch more of our videos about dinosaurs and other cool stuff. Thanks for coming along on this journey through time.